Kia ora, I'm Nadine Higgins and welcome to the Prosperity Project. Today, your first home is seldom your forever home, right? So while getting onto that first rung of the property ladder is a huge effort and a huge achievement, what do you need to know to get onto the next rung? Whether it's a rising market or a sluggish one, there is a bit to get your head around when you're selling your home and buying another, especially if you're trying to get that extra bedroom or the double garage. So to help us step through it, we are joined by Squirrel mortgage advisor Kat McInnes. Kia ora, Kat.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the show. We'll get into all of that very shortly, but we've just recently had the official cash rate revised down again, 3%. And perhaps more importantly, we're told now it might get down a little further than we thought. So what does that mean for me if I'm trying to fix my mortgage right now? Does that mean I'm going to get better rates?
Potentially, yes, in the shorter term. So we had the banks move about a week before the cash rate. So we saw some of the fixed rates come down already. We've got, at the moment, we're sort of looking at a 1-year rate around about 4.76 is the best we're seeing, through to a 3-year at about 4.95. A bit of a mix of what my clients are doing at the moment. Everyone's keen to try and get a lower rate if they can.
Always.
Yes. But we've got to remember it's not that long ago that we had a 1-year rate in the high sixes. So for a lot of people, to know that they can get some certainty with a rate starting with a 4, they're quite happy to go with one of those slightly longer terms, a 2 or a 3 year. Largely what I would recommend at the moment would be a split. So having some on a shorter term so we can take advantage if the rates come down, and some a little bit longer just to have that certainty.
Yeah, and it all depends on the situation you're in, right? Is it crucial that you secure the lowest rate because everything's so tight, or is actually security for a longer term better? Right? Horses for courses.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Right, well, let's talk about trading up. I guess if you're a first home buyer, the one advantage you have is that you're only dealing with the buying bit, not the selling bit. So is it fair to say it's a little bit more complex when you're dealing with people who are trying to both sell a home, get a good price, and also buy the next?
Yes, absolutely. If you think about, if we think back to buying our first home, it's not only the admin, the lawyers, the agents, the valuations, building reports, and the emotions that go into that. Think about doing all of that again while also trying to sell a house. It's definitely a little bit more complicated, and I think for a lot of people a bit of a surprise when they actually get to that step. They go, oh, this is trickier than I thought.
And I have heard real estate agents go, oh, look, hot market, buy first, sell later. Is that a good idea, or is that inherently quite risky?
I would probably say it's inherently quite risky. So look, you've got a couple of options when you're looking to trade up. So you can either sell first, or you can look to hold on to your current property and then make an offer. So the advantage of selling a property first is that you've sort of got a little bit more control over the process. So if you're selling your own home, you can do things like make sure you've got a really long settlement period, which will give you time to find another property. It's going to give you certainty around your budget for your next property because you know what you've sold for. And it also means that effectively you're able to do things like go to auction. You're in a more similar position to someone who's not owning a house at the moment.
So you kind of, it puts you in a cashed up position rather than having to put in an offer that says it's conditional on me selling my home, and so they're going to want, more money out of me in order to accept those conditions?
Yeah. So the biggest risk if you put an offer in subject to the sale of your own home is that generally most people will also have an escape clause in that contract. So if they accept your offer and someone else comes along who is a cash buyer, then you generally have sort of 5 to 10 days to confirm that contract. Now, if you haven't sold, you're not going to be able to do that, and that can be pretty heartbreaking.
So you think you've secured the house, but someone else could still come along, undercut you, and you miss out anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds like it makes a stressful situation, buying and selling houses, more stressful to buy before you sell. Why then do people do it?
I think often it can feel pretty unnerving to sell when you haven't got a property lined up. And the worst case scenario of that is if you do sell your property and you actually don't find your dream home, then you're sort of out on your ear, I guess. You might be looking for a rental or a short-term Airbnb, that type of thing. So many people like the security of knowing they can stay in their own home until they've got that next property lined up. The other thing that probably happens more often is almost impulse buys. So someone will start, they'll get an idea that they might like to move, and then they'll fall in love with something and sort of move ahead.
And they just can't possibly move fast enough to get the two to line up.
Yeah.
So how does the financing of that work if you buy before you sell? You have to get the bank on board if you can't get those settlement dates or those conditions to line up?
Yes. So I guess what you're talking about is what we call bridging finance. So there's two forms of bridging finance. It's either closed or open. So bridging is essentially short-term finance to allow you to settle on that new property when you haven't yet sold yours. Now, closed bridging means that your property will have sold, but you've got a gap in your settlement dates. So you might be settling on your new property on the 1st of the month and yours isn't selling until the end of the month, for example. So you just need some short-term funding for a month or so.
And so the closed refers to there is an end date.
That's right.
But we're just getting a bridge between those two dates.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. That's a lot more doable. The other scenario is an open bridge. So an open bridge is when you haven't sold your property yet, but you do have your new property lined up and a confirmed settlement for that. Open bridging is tricky. It is pretty hard to get finance for that these days.
And that is just because banks don't like uncertainty, right? You might not get the price you were looking for from your original home, and you could end up with two loans for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. And when we're looking at the main banks, they are obligated to make sure they're lending in a responsible manner. So they're going to look at the worst case scenario and say, look, if you can't sell for any reason, can you afford to keep repaying both of these loans? If the answer is no, then you're not probably going to be able to get open bridging through one of the main banks. There are options through what we call non-bank or specialist lenders, but they're pricey.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because when you said short-term financing, usually what that means is much more expensive.
Yes.
So whether it's closed or open, can we expect to pay a higher interest rate than we normally would on a regular mortgage?
With closed, we can generally get that through a main bank. A couple of things to note on that. The banks are going to be a little bit more conservative on the loan-to-value ratio. So typically they would probably want to see no more than 70% across both properties. So if you're fairly highly geared, then that's not going to be an option for you. But a closed bridge, if we've got that with a mainstream bank, you'd probably expect to pay a percentage point above the floating rate. So not too bad. And the best thing is we know that that's for a set period of time, so it's a known cost.
Yeah, so you can actually budget.
Absolutely. Yes.
And is it principal and interest on both loans, or do you revert one of them to interest only because it's for a short period, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the bridging loan would automatically be interest only generally, so that's the amount that you'd be intending to repay once you sold your property. But usually with a bit of negotiation, we can secure interest only over the whole lot if you needed it.
So what are some of the things that could go wrong if you're looking at that more risky scenario of an open bridge?
So, something that's probably quite relevant, well, around the country really, but is some of the weather events we've been having. So, for example, if you've got a property on the market and we have another event like happened over the last few years, potentially that's going to cause a problem with sale of your property. Another quite common thing that often doesn't come up until you start working with an agent and checking property files is work that's been done on a property that's not consented. You'd think you would be aware of this, but it just doesn't always seem to be the case. That type of thing can cause issues for finance for the people that are trying to buy your house. So again, it might just slow down that process.
So you could end up being one of those people who, in the midst of having bought a home, got some financing to close the bridge, and you haven't sold yours yet, and then yours is impacted by a Cyclone Gabriel. I mean, that must be nightmare scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And the banks do think with that sort of thinking, they're like, what could go wrong here? Another thing just to be mindful of is that the banks will be looking quite closely at the security, so at the properties behind bridging. If you think about a normal loan, the exit for that loan is that you're going to pay it back. But the exit for a bridging loan is the sale of that property. So the bank's going to be looking a little bit more carefully at the property that you're selling. If it has some risk factors, so for example, if it's a plaster property, if it has been impacted by weather events in the past, the banks might be a little bit more conservative about that.
And they don't like unconsented work, presumably.
They don't. And it's surprisingly common.
Yeah, that's that Kiwi DIY sort of attitude.
Very much so.
When you're a first home buyer, you're typically, you're having to get your building reports and your LIM reports and your valuations. If you're buying a second time, and say you have sold yours, so you're good to go, do you still have to get a valuation on the second property? Do they treat you the same way as they do a first home buyer?
Yeah, no, not always. I mean, generally when you're stepping up to that next property, you're probably going to have a little bit more equity. So a lot of the reasons for the extra requirements for first home buyers is that they may have a lower deposit, 10, 15%, for example, and that will automatically trigger things like valuations and the bank looking a little bit more closely at the property. Once you've got more equity, there's probably not going to be so many requirements like that, but the bank always has the right to ask for a valuation if they feel that it's appropriate. Generally, if it's an arm's length transaction through an agent, they won't require one, but if it's a private sale, that's the sort of thing that might trigger it. The other thing that may trigger a valuation request would be if you were paying significantly over a desktop or online valuation.
Right, so they're doing that in the background regardless, and then if you're like, actually I want to bid another $300,000, they'd be like, ooh, okay. And we're lending you too much on this property.
Yeah, that's right.
Do they go through your finances the same way? Because I guess you've got this evidence of, hey, look, I've paid a mortgage for however long. But if you're wanting to borrow more, are they still going to be going through with a relatively fine-tooth comb?
Yeah, still the same assessment. So banks are still obligated to make sure that you can afford those repayments, particularly if interest rates do go up again. So, yep, same assessment.
And what sort of test rates are we looking at the moment, given interest rates have come down so much?
Roughly 7% with most banks.
Yeah, okay. So that's an easier hurdle, I guess, to get across than what we were seeing only, 12 months ago.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to take a quick break and then we're going to talk to Kat about some of the complicating factors when buying your next home. If you have, say, a property secured against the one you're selling, how does that work? We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Prosperity Project. We're talking about taking the next step on the property ladder after your first home when you're trading up to maybe get that extra bedroom or whatever it is that you need to house your family. But there can be some complexities. For example, Kat, say you're selling a home, but you've actually somewhere along the line purchased an investment property. It's secured against that home. What happens when you sell the home it's secured against?
Good question. I think most of us would sort of expect that if you've got property A and then you've got a loan for property A and you've got property B and a loan for property B, in your mind they sort of stand alone. But in the banks, in reality with the banks, that's kind of one big pool of assets and one big pool of lending. By default, when you sell a property, the bank has the right to take the full sale proceeds. So they can pay back the loan against property A, but they can also pay down some of the loan against property B, which a lot of people don't expect to happen.
Right. So I think that I get that money and I get to put it toward my next home, but the bank might say, actually, we're going to pay down some of this investment property debt and I've got less left over.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there any way around that?
Yeah, there is. So, there's obviously going to be certain rules that the bank will have to follow. So, for example, if you're keeping an investment property, the bank is going to need that lending paid down to at least 70% of the current value. But outside of that, they can make exceptions. So just because they have the right to take the full proceeds doesn't mean they have to. But the key thing is to be talking to them early about what you want to do and what the plan is, so there's no surprises at the last minute.
And I guess if you're saying you have to pay it down to 70% of the current value, then maybe if the value has gone up, you might have more equity in it than you initially put in, right? So maybe you're not forced to tip more in?
Yeah, absolutely. But not to be negative, that can go the other way as well, unfortunately.
Fair point. Well made.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so, if the property value has dropped, then you may have to pay down a little bit more than you were expecting.
Is this a case in point for the argument against cross-securing properties? Because if I had gone and got the loan for the investment property with a different bank and I sell my home, there's less risk, right, that the bank can then make me pay down the other one because it's a different bank.
Yeah, 100%. Yep, the bank can only take what is with them.
So is that the point at which that if you were cross-collateralized, as they call it, you should try and unwind that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, obviously getting good advice when you first buy that investment property so that we can set you up in the right way is really important. But yeah, if you are at the point where you're thinking that you might sell a property and you have got more than one property secured with that same bank, a good idea to talk to an advisor and start to think about how we can better set you up for when you do sell.
Yeah, I guess that's all about that risk minimisation. So you get to call the shots a little bit more with the proceeds rather than the bank, because they do what's right for the bank rather than, what you would like to spend on your new home. Is there I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this one, Kat, but it just occurred to me. Is there an average that people tend to spend when they trade up? Because for some, it seems like a big leap. Like, I've worked so hard to get on the property ladder, but now I want 4 bedrooms because I've had triplets or whatever it is. Perish the thought. But moving to that next leg up on the property ladder seems like such a big stretch again.
Yeah. I don't know if there's an average as such, but I think probably the most common, we sort of see it at key times in life that people start to think about this. So it might be as your family's growing. Probably the other really key time that we see people wanting to trade up is when we've got kids going to high school.
And they want to get in the zone.
And they want to get into a better zone, yeah. So that's often a big driver. And for that sort of thing, when you're not only perhaps looking for a little bit more house, but a
posher suburb.
Yeah. You can be looking at, 500,000, $1 million to get what you want. So, yeah, look, it can definitely vary.
Wow. Okay. And I guess the other thing is you might have lived in your first home for, what's the average, 7 years, and you took out a 30-year loan, so you're 7 years in, 23 years left to run. Do people tend to start again from 30? So you're 7 years older, and we're going to take out a fresh 30-year mortgage, or does the bank at a certain point start to go, do you know what, maybe only 25?
It was a bit of a shock to me when I turned 40 to realise that actually a 30-year term was probably no longer a default for me.
Oh gosh. Okay. Yeah. Now you've given me some real food for thought.
So it's really important to say that banks cannot discriminate on age.
Except they do, don't they?
So what they do look at is the sustainability of your income. So there's sort of another big picture thing going on here. So if you've got a number of investment properties, if you've got a significant share portfolio, if you've got a $5 million property that you owe $1 million on that you could reasonably downsize, the bank is probably going to feel a little bit more comfortable giving you that longer loan term because you've got lots of options to eventually exit it if you had to.
So they're not going to be kicking a pensioner out on their ears.
Yeah, that's not good optics. Well, it's not good headlines for them if that happens. So that's why they have to be careful. However, if it is your only property, and you will be living in it, it's probably pretty reasonable to expect that the bank is going to want a loan term that's not going to take you past retirement. The other thing just to note on that is that actually there are some quite different policies between the banks around loan terms. So you may find that some are going to be a little bit more conservative. They will have a bit of a hard line on that retirement age, whereas others will be a little bit more open to a longer term for the right reasons. So again, talking to a good advisor is going to help there.
One thing I do hear a lot of people want to do is, my first home, it has such great memories, it was such a brilliant first home, I'm going to hold on to it. Mm-hmm. And it's going to become a rental, and then I'm going to buy my second home. Mm-hmm. Is that a good idea?
Oh, that is a hard question. It's very common. And I think that you do need to try your hardest to remove the emotion from it. I say that, and I did that exact thing.
Did you?
Yes. I just couldn't quite bear to let it go. But after a year of having it as a rental, I was like, no, this is not for me.
That took some of the romance out of it.
It did. It absolutely did. So look, it's valid, but what we want to look at is whether it actually is the right property to be a rental. And sometimes it makes more sense to sell it, get the home you want, and then we'll help you with the plan to buy a more appropriate rental property if your first home is not the right sort of one.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing with that is how the debt is structured, because they usually tell you, right, put the debt against the property that's tax deductible, which is the rental. But if you're leveraging against the rental to buy your second home, then isn't the debt going to be stacked against the home and not the rental.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. So really important if you are looking at that particular scenario where a property that was your own home is going to become a rental, that you do get really good advice from an accountant, and an accountant that specialises in property tax matters.
Yeah, because otherwise I guess you get it all round the wrong way.
Yes,
right?
And it can be hard to unwind later on.
Yeah. Do you have to stick with the same bank you have been with if you're going from one to the next, or is that the point at which you could cast around and see whether there's someone else who will come to the party, or is it better to go with the one that already knows you, or do they even know you these days?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things to think about there. So sometimes it can be easier to stay with the same bank. So if you're, particularly if we step back to that bridging scenario, so if your bank has agreed to do a closed bridge for you, then you're probably going to be sticking with them. Often you might need your current bank to give you a top-up to pay the deposit on the next property. So again, that existing bank that you have the relationship with is the one that's going to be helping you. However, it doesn't hurt to look at other options. And it can still be done if it makes sense to move banks.
So if we are in this process of moving, what are some of the costs we need to factor in? Is it just the usual, the lawyer, the mover, maybe the stager, something else?
Yeah, I guess it's just all of the usual costs that you would have experienced when you were a first home buyer, but you can probably double the overall cost when you're selling at the same time in terms of legal fees and that sort of thing as well.
I guess one of the things, if we go back to that scenario of holding on to the first home, at least you're not incurring the commission in that process, right? If you're holding on to it. But I guess if you sell it eventually, then, they'll get you in the end. So I guess from your perspective, you must see people come to you at varying stages of the process, some organised, some not organised. What do we need to avoid doing, and what do we need to do to try and make what is a stressful situation a little bit less stressful?
I think that the number one most important thing is to get advice early on, because then you're going to have a really clear idea of what is possible for you. If you've got really strong income, if you've got plenty of equity, we may be able to get you bridging finance, and you'll then know that. But the last thing I think you want to do is impulsively pop an offer on a property, expect to get bridging, and find that you can't. So,
because what are the consequences of that if you put in an offer but then you actually can't settle on it? I presume it's pretty dire.
Yeah, it would be pretty dire if you can't settle. I mean, hopefully your offer was conditional and you could withdraw, but
have you seen any disaster cases where you couldn't help them dig out of the mess they'd made?
I'd say most of the time we can find some sort of option if you're prepared to pay for it.
Right, so there's a price tag attached. Yeah. And that's probably a tax on your sanity as well, right? Because if you're going to the lender of last resort, it's stressful.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Kat, you are a mine of information. Thanks for your time today.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project. You can follow this podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and please do chuck us a rating or a review while you're there. For more personal finance and business content, head to nzherald.co.nz, and please do feel free to get in touch with your questions and your stories, nadine.higgins at nzme.co.nz. A reminder, though, that this podcast is informational only, and nothing we say here should be considered personalised financial advice. But also remember that while listening to this podcast is hopefully going to be additive to your financial knowledge, and that is fantastic, knowing stuff doesn't create change. Doing stuff does. So what action are you going to take today to make your life more prosperous? My producer for this episode is Ethan Sills. Sound engineer is Richard Martin. I'm Nadine Higgins. Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project. Brought to you by moneyfit.me.